At Louisiana State Penitentiary, known to the world as Angola Prison, the calendar is not just paper and ink. For the men on death row, it is a countdown. Every crossed-out date brings them closer to a moment the state has already scheduled. This is the story of one of those men, and how a single hidden truth nearly sent an innocent person to die. Before we begin, if you're drawn to stories that expose the darkest corners of the justice system, where one decision can mean life or death, make sure you're subscribed, leave a like, and share your thoughts below. These stories matter because they are real. On a humid April night in 1999, the execution chamber at Angola Prison was silent. Guards moved with rehearsed precision. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and behind thick walls, a man waited to be strapped down. This was death row as it truly existed, not as an idea, but as a place where the state prepared to end a life on schedule. The man was John Thompson. By then, Angola Prison had already earned its reputation. Once a former slave plantation, it had become the largest maximum security prison in the United States. Its death row stretched along a narrow corridor where inmates lived for decades in cells no larger than a parking space, each one aware that the state of Louisiana reserved the right to decide the day they would die. John Thompson had lived in that corridor for 14 years. His journey to Angola began in New Orleans in 1984. That year, the city was shaken by a brutal crime. Charles Dunbar, a respected advertising executive, was shot and killed during an attempted armed robbery near the city's uptown neighborhood. The murder drew intense public attention. A white, well-known businessman had been killed in broad daylight, and pressure mounted on police and prosecutors to act quickly. Within weeks, John Thompson, a 22-year-old black man, was arrested. The case against him appeared strong on paper. A witness identified Thompson as the man who shot Dunbar. Prosecutors claimed Thompson had used a .22 caliber revolver. They painted him as a career criminal, dangerous and unrepentant. In court, the jury heard little that challenged that narrative. What they never heard was what the prosecution already knew. Before Thompson ever stood trial for murder, prosecutors charged him with an unrelated armed robbery. That case went to trial first. Thompson was convicted and sentenced to 49.5 years in prison. The conviction mattered because it legally prevented him from testifying in his own defense at the later murder trial. Without his voice, the state's version of events went largely unchallenged. The murder trial moved fast. The jury deliberated. Thompson was found guilty. Then came the sentence: death. By the time Thompson arrived at Angola Prison's death row, he understood what that sentence truly meant. Angola was isolated, surrounded by farmland and razor wire. There were no quick appeals, no easy exits. Men entered death row knowing many would never leave alive. Years passed. Appeals failed. Execution dates were set, postponed, then reset. Each time, Thompson watched other inmates walk past his cell for the last time. Some prayed, some shouted, some said nothing at all. The waiting was its own punishment. By the late 1990s, Thompson's execution date was no longer theoretical. It was real, fixed, and approaching. His attorneys, running out of legal options, began digging deeper into old files, transcripts, and evidence logs that had not been closely examined in years. That's when they noticed something strange. In the armed robbery case, police reports mentioned blood found at the scene. According to trial testimony, the robber had cut himself during the crime. Thompson, however, had no injuries. Still, prosecutors insisted the blood evidence was irrelevant and never presented it to the defense. Thompson's legal team requested access to the evidence. What they found stopped them cold. The blood had been tested years earlier. The results were clear. It did not match John Thompson. Under the law, prosecutors were required to turn over evidence that could help the defense. They never did. That single decision had changed everything. Because of the robbery conviction, Thompson had been silenced at his own murder trial, and because of that, he had been sentenced to death. As Thompson sat in his cell at Angola, execution date looming, his lawyers realized the truth was not just buried. It had been deliberately withheld. And if they were right, the state of Louisiana was days away from executing an innocent man. The discovery of the blood evidence changed the tone of everything. What had once been a desperate, procedural fight against an execution date became something far more dangerous for the state. If the courts accepted what Thompson's attorneys had uncovered, it would not just undermine one conviction, it would expose a failure at the heart of the prosecution. The legal clock was ticking. Thompson's execution was scheduled for May 20, 1999. With only weeks remaining, his attorneys filed an emergency motion, arguing that prosecutors had violated the Constitution by withholding exculpatory evidence. In legal terms, it was known as a Brady violation. In human terms, it meant the difference between life and death. Inside Angola Prison, Thompson was told what his lawyers had found. For the first time in years, there was a crack in the certainty of his fate. But hope on death row was dangerous. Many men had believed their cases would turn, only to be proven wrong. Thompson prepared himself for both outcomes. Outside the prison walls, the courtroom became a battleground. Prosecutors did not deny the blood evidence existed. Instead, they argued it was insignificant. They claimed the armed robbery conviction was solid without it, and that the murder case stood on its own. Without it, the jury might have heard a different story. Without it, Thompson might never have been sent to death row. The judge agreed to halt the execution temporarily. For the first time in 15 years, John Thompson stepped out of the shadow of imminent death. But freedom was not yet on the table. The armed robbery conviction was overturned, wiping out the foundation that had silenced him at his murder trial. Still, the murder conviction remained. Thompson stayed at Angola, though no longer under an active execution warrant. What followed was something rarely seen. With the robbery case erased, prosecutors were forced to retry the murder charge. In 2003, nearly 2 decades after Charles Dunbar was killed, Thompson walked into a courtroom again, this time as a man who could speak for himself. The difference was immediate. Jurors heard about inconsistencies in eyewitness testimony. They learned about alternative suspects that had never been fully investigated. They saw how the original case had been shaped by pressure to solve a high-profile crime quickly. And this time, the jury also learned about the blood evidence. After weeks of testimony, the verdict came back: not guilty. John Thompson walked out of court a free man. After 18 years in prison, 14 of them on death row at Angola, he stepped into the sunlight without shackles. Reporters surrounded him. Cameras flashed. He spoke calmly, without bitterness, saying only that he was grateful to be alive. But the story did not end there. Thompson filed a civil lawsuit against the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, arguing that the suppression of evidence had stolen nearly 2 decades of his life. In 2007, a jury agreed. They awarded him $14 million in damages, one of the largest verdicts of its kind at the time. For a moment, it seemed like accountability had finally arrived. Then the state appealed. The case climbed all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 2011, the court reversed the jury's decision. Prosecutors, the court ruled, could not be held financially liable unless a pattern of similar misconduct could be proven, not just a single devastating failure. The ruling sent shockwaves through the legal world. John Thompson lost the compensation, but the damage had already been done to the system's credibility. His case became a national symbol of how easily a person could be condemned to die, not because of overwhelming evidence, but because of what a jury was never allowed to see. Back at Angola Prison, death row continued to function as it always had. Men woke up, ate alone, waited alone, and watched the calendar. Thompson's story spread among them like a quiet warning. If it could happen to him, it could happen to anyone. Investigations by journalists and legal organizations began to uncover more troubling patterns. Angola was not just housing the guilty, it was housing men whose convictions depended on questionable testimony, missing evidence, and prosecutors who faced little consequence for misconduct. The execution chamber remained ready. By the time Thompson's case was studied in law schools and cited in courtrooms, the question had shifted. It was no longer just about one man who almost died. It was about how many others were still sitting on death row, waiting for evidence that might never be found, or truths that might never be revealed. And deep inside Angola Prison, there were inmates who had watched Thompson leave alive, wondering if the same miracle would ever come for them. Because for some of them, the state had already chosen a date. By the time John Thompson's ordeal had made national headlines, Angola Prison had already earned a reputation as the Alcatraz of the South. Its walls weren't just stone and barbed wire, they were built on decades of pain, injustice, and stories that few outside Louisiana ever heard. But Thompson's case, extraordinary as it was, exposed only a fraction of what happened behind those gates. Inside Angola, men continued to live with the daily reminder of mortality, a small calendar on the wall of their cells, each date crossed off with deliberate care. Some drew pictures, wrote letters, or prayed. Others did nothing at all, sitting silently, listening to the distant clanging of doors and the muffled shouts of guards. The psychological toll of waiting for death was immense. Many inmates developed severe anxiety, depression, or outright despair. Time had no meaning except as a countdown. The question Thompson's case raised was unavoidable. If evidence could be hidden or mishandled once, how many others had no champion, no second chance, no miracle? By 2005, investigative journalists had begun digging into Angola's death row. Records showed that a significant number of death row inmates had questionable convictions, some relying solely on witness testimony, some with key physical evidence never disclosed, and others coerced into confessions under pressure. Interviews with former guards painted a troubling picture. Favoritism, corruption, and fear were common, and the prison's sheer size made oversight nearly impossible. One name that stood out during these investigations was Patrick Lane. Lane had been sentenced to death for a murder in Baton Rouge in 1992. Like Thompson, he maintained his innocence, but his appeals were slow, and the system moved cautiously, almost indifferently, to his pleas. His case seemed routine until journalists uncovered a letter hidden in the court files, a letter written by a key witness recanting their testimony, admitting that police pressure had forced them to implicate Lane falsely. Lane's execution date had already been set. When the legal team presented the letter, the state scrambled. Emergency hearings were scheduled, and for days, the press speculated whether the execution would proceed. By a narrow margin, the court granted a stay, citing the witness recantation. Lane's life was spared, at least temporarily. The chilling reality was clear. Death row at Angola was a high-stakes lottery, where timing, luck, and the diligence of lawyers determined life or death. Mistakes or misconduct could and often did mean that an innocent man might be executed. Back inside the prison, the men knew these stories. They whispered names in the dark, shared rumors, and watched the news obsessively. Each new revelation about a botched investigation, a hidden piece of evidence, or a last-minute stay became part of the grim mythology of Angola. It created an environment of tension and paranoia, where even trust between inmates was rare. The public response was fierce. Thompson's case, along with stories like Lane's, fueled debates over the death penalty nationwide. Legal scholars argued that the justice system's errors, even one, were enough to reconsider capital punishment. Critics highlighted systemic issues, racial bias, underfunded defense, and prosecutorial misconduct. Supporters of the death penalty, however, insisted that Angola represented a necessary deterrent, pointing to the violent crimes of those housed there. Yet for the men living inside the walls, statistics and arguments mattered little. Each day was a test of endurance. For some, escape was only psychological. They tried to imagine life outside, to dream about freedom, to cling to hope. For others, death became a constant companion, haunting every step and every breath. Then came the final revelation that shook the system to its core. A former Angola warden, speaking to a national newspaper, admitted that during Thompson's incarceration, multiple death row inmates' cases had been mishandled due to institutional complacency and pressure to meet execution quotas. The admission sent tremors through legal circles. If such systemic failures existed under Thompson's watchful years, the number of potentially innocent men was higher than anyone dared imagine. Angola Prison remained operational and changed in appearance, but transformed in the public consciousness. What had once been a distant, almost mythical institution was now recognized as a symbol of both human cruelty and institutional failure, a place where mistakes were fatal, but occasionally, miracles like Thompson's could occur. John Thompson's story ended not with vengeance, but with survival. He lived to see his case expose a system that was flawed, unjust, and sometimes deadly. Yet for every Thompson, there were others, Patrick Lane, and countless unnamed men still living each day under the shadow of an execution date, wondering if they too would ever escape death's grip. Angola Prison remained, silent and unyielding, as it had for decades. Its gates loomed over the Louisiana farmland, and inside, men continued to mark the passage of time. The executions continued, one by one, a grim reminder that for some, justice comes too late, if at all. The story of Angola's death row is a cautionary tale, a testament to resilience, and a warning about the fragility of the human life when the state holds the final say. And while John Thompson's survival gave hope, the legacy of the prison, its shadow over humanity and justice, remains, haunting anyone who dares to step too close. If you think the story was intense, you're not ready for the full truth of America's death row. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next one.